All right, hello. So today I want to read this article by, I believe you say it, Kaj Sotala. I'm not sure. I've only seen the name a million times, but I've never heard it said out loud, so apologies on my pronunciation. But, in running Shift 30 for 30 this past week now, and talking about it the month leading up to this week. This is obviously a big topic. I linked to this article in my thread where I announced Shift 30. The truth is that I have not yet read it. I have read Kai's article on internal family systems, which I really, really liked. I read that early on in my time of learning about IFS, and it really helped me understand it better. So I respect Kai's writing and thinking about these things. And yeah, like I was saying, with Shift 30 for 30, what a felt sense is, how we access it, why we access, like what the point is, what it's good for, let alone what a felt shift is, right? What a felt shift is, and how do we know if we're experiencing one? Those are all questions that have been coming up on calls, in DMs, etc. Or even sometimes it's just me realizing, like, oh, it would have been good to share a better definition of what these things are to help these conversations go more smoothly. So that's partly why I want to make this video. Read this article, one, because I wanted to read it for a long time, and two, perhaps it can help anyone who's wondering about what these things are, what a felt sense is, what a felt shift is, what's the benefit of any of that stuff. And yeah, so I'll just dive right in. It's not terribly long, so I think I can do it all in one session. So yeah, that's preamble. This is The Felt Sense, What, Why, and How by Kaj Sotala. So, while Less Wrong has seen previous discussion of focusing, I feel like there has been relatively limited discussion of the felt sense. That is, the thing that focusing is actually accessing. Everyone accesses felt senses all the time, but most people don't know that they're doing it. I think that being able to make the skill more explicit is really valuable, and in this post, I'm going to give lots of examples of why that is and what you can do with it. Hopefully, after I'm done, you will not only know what a felt sense is, if you didn't already, but also will have difficulty understanding how you ever got by without this concept. So, yeah, I just want to highlight this thing up here that while people talk about focusing, even more important in many ways is simply to talk about the felt sense, because you can get caught up in focusing as a method, and there are people, sometimes I'm this way, who get so caught up in the details of doing the method correctly and what are all the steps and exactly how do I go about this thing, that you forget about the point of it. You forget about the spirit of it. You forget why it's there, right? Like Eugene Genlin has his process in his book, Focusing, but he breaks it down in other ways in other books. He has students who break it down in other ways again, right? So focusing is not one strict process. All of it is about enabling us to better access and work with and explore the felt sense. That's the main thing. And I've been rereading and studying my highlights from focusing oriented therapy, right? And I think you could say the same thing for that. It's not about doing focusing perfectly. It's about understanding that the point is the felt sense and bringing the felt sense into whatever process and whatever method you want to use, because they can all work. Right? It's not about making focusing the one and only method that we use. Jen explicitly says, don't do that. It's about bringing the felt sense in to whatever thing that we are doing, so that we have a way to check for whether it's actually doing anything, whether it's actually helping us experience therapeutic movement, experience emotional movement. So if you want to know more about that, and you've got time on your hands, then check out my other videos going through those notes. But I'm sure that this article will do a quicker, faster, better job of articulating this stuff. So, examples of felt senses. The term felt sense was originally coined by the psychologist Eugene Gendlin as a name for something that he found his clients to be accessing in their therapy sessions. Quick note, Eugene Gendlin is not primarily a psychologist. He is a professor. He was a professor of philosophy, and then he also worked in psychology and was a student of Carl Rogers. But first and foremost, Eugene Gendlin's work is in philosophy, so that's not something that's usually understood about him. But anyway, so here are some examples of felt senses. Think of some person you know, maybe imagining what it feels like to be in the same room as them. You probably have some sense of that person, of what it is they feel like. Likewise, if you think of some fictional universe, it has something of its own feel. Harry Potter feels different from Star Wars, feels different from Game of Thrones, feels different from James Bond. Yeah, maybe a word that's coming up is ambiance, right? And obviously he's talking about movies here, but you can think about going to different kinds of restaurants, and the different kinds of feelings that you get in each restaurant. You might order the same dish, you might be there with the same people, but each restaurant has a different ambiance through a combination of everything that's there, right? The people who occupy it, the people working there, how they are, the music, the lighting, the smells, all these things, the size of the space, the time of day, ambiance. It creates this, I wonder if Kai will use this word. It's not really a accurate word, but vibe, right? That's another way to really casually talk about the felt sense, is a vibe. Sometimes you will have a word right on the tip of your tongue. It's as if the word is almost there, but you can't quite reach it. When you do, you just know that it's the right word, because the shape of the word matches the one you were reaching for before. Yeah, that's an example that Gendlin uses a lot. It's like, what the heck is going on there? You know that you're forgetting a word. Other people can try to help you think of what it was, and they might offer you options for maybe, what is it, this word, is it that word, or maybe it's a name, right? Was it this name? And you know that you're forgetting, but when they tell you these different options, or if you think of something, you also know that it's not right. But you also don't know what the actual thing is that you're trying to remember, right? So how the heck, how the heck does that work? There's a felt sense. You can't actually see it. You can't actually say it. You can't truly bring it back to mind yet, but there's like a shape of it. There's a sense to that thing. Okay. The felt senses of pictures. Here are a few pictures that I recently collected from the Facebook group Steampunk Tendencies. So hopefully you can kind of see these. I know the resolution on these videos is not that great. How do you feel when you look at these pictures? What's the general vibe that unites all of these pictures, right? And you can make a checklist, right? You could be like, oh, they have the same color scheme, they have the same themes, the style of art is similar, right? And you could try to make all of these check marks, but the sum total of the check marks doesn't quite arrive at just the feeling that it gives you, right? It gives you a feeling before you explicitly identify any particular thing. It's like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the whole, yet, is this vague thing that you can't quite describe because no description of it is quite gets at the whole thing. Likely, you can find quite a few. If I put aside the word steampunk and Victorian, next I get the word mechanical, dark, also feels fitting, right? And as you put words to it, they do help you. It's like, oh, I'm getting a grasp on it a little more. That felt sense isn't so nebulous anymore. And again, that's what you're doing in focusing when you try to put words to your own felt sense in your body. You're trying to put words to it, and it becomes, you get handles for the felt sense, and bit by bit, step by step, it's no longer so nebulous, and maybe you actually get a hold of it, and now it's a thing, and you have words for it, and you can name it. That's what thinking at the edge is, which is the philosophical version of focusing, right? Putting names around these vague, nebulous ideas until you have a new way to talk about this thing that you had no language for before. And that's how you get new concepts. Anyway, whatever the vibe that you get, it's probably something different than the one you get from this collection of images. Look at the first set of images, then the second. How does it feel when you switch looking from one to the other? What kinds of changes are there in your mind and your body? That's the important thing too, right? As I mentioned, like you could make a checklist, you could call out all of the things that are similar to all of these pictures, right? And you could do the same thing for all of these, but we're not talking about making a list and just describing it. We're talking about what the felt sense is that we get. We're not talking about what we can put on paper and give to another person and they can be like, yep, that's an accurate description of this collection of images. We're talking about what's the feeling in us, in our bodies, when we look at these things. I like both sets, but looking from one to the other, I notice that the forest images make me feel like my mind is opening up, whereas the steampunk ones make it close a little. Comparing the two, I feel like there's some slightly off-putting vibe in the steampunk set that makes me prefer looking at the forest images, which I would not have noticed if I hadn't viewed them side to side. I'm guessing that some readers will have the opposite experience of finding the forest ones off-putting compared to the steampunk ones. Again, let me just scroll up to these. right? For me, it's like, oh, they're like soft, they're lighter. It's like relaxing. Obviously, these have sensible themes in them, right? There's trees, forest scenes. I can associate also like a whole set of sound qualities that go with this kind of imagery. Compare that to the kind of sounds perhaps that you might imagine go with this, which would be like clanking and industrial and maybe screeching, rumbling. Right? But again, it's not about the descriptions, but the feeling that you get. Okay. Emotional and mental states as felt senses. Internal emotional and mental states can also have their own felt senses. That shouldn't be very surprising, since your experience of, for example, a set of pictures is an internal mental state. Here are a few examples of felt senses from this other person. When I solve a problem in a creative way, for example, fix posture by turning in the shower, there's a sensation of enlightenment at the back of my head, which literally feels like my skull is opening up. The words to this feeling are, I've discovered a new dimension. Sometimes I sit slouched over in bed for hours at a time, browsing Facebook or Reddit, playing video games, or binge watching a season of a TV show. After getting up from the slouch, my whole body is enveloped in a haze of laziness and decay. A zombie haze is thickest inside my ribs. The words to this pressure are symptoms of the spreading corruption. So just like pointing out some words here, right? There's a enveloped, right? A haze, decay, thickness, right? And then there's a location and where in your body. Pressure, slouch, which is a diff, right, of like how your body is shaped and your posture. We're talking about sensation here, right? But not just necessarily sensation, like, oh, there's a tension right there, but it's like this sort of the entire environment of sensation and how that feels like. I've heard other people describe it as the weather. What's the weather of your body right now? How does the weather inside of you feel? Right, and weather is not just, is it sunny or is it raining or is it cloudy, but it's like, oh, what's the wind like, what's the humidity level, things like that. Okay. A piece of my social anxiety forms a hard barrier that pushes against the center of my chest. I learned the words to this feeling from a post by that guy. Conform. Every time you walk outside the norm, think about the implicit accusation you're making against everyone who didn't try it. Interesting. Yeah, so there's a hard barrier. But again, that hard barrier itself is not necessarily a felt sense. It's a sense, it's a somatic sense located in the center of the chest, right? But then there's also more words to it. There's a conform thing, right? And that brings it with it its own sense. And you think about your relationship to other people and how you're orienting yourself to other people. Like all of that is involved, and it creates this overall ecosystem of feeling inside of your body. Sometimes it's easy to come up with words to describe a felt sense, but typically it takes a bit of time to find exactly the right ones. I expect that it took some time for this guy to find evocative descriptions such as the above. Here's Duncan Sabian describing the experience of honing down on a particular felt sense. I've edited out some excellent elaborations and pictures that were included between these lines. The whole post is recommended reading. Okay, so there's clearly something bothering me. So that's something, if you've seen any other videos or read Genlin, he often just uses not an ellipses, but a series of 4 dots, right? And it's just like, there's no words for it, but it's a something. There's a space trying to point at something, but it's still nebulous. So there's clearly something bothering me, and it's got something to do with Cameron. Have we been fighting a lot? No, that's not it at all. It's more like I never know what to say. So here too, right? This is what Genlin and Carl Rogers discovered in their research, was that critical component of what makes therapy work is if someone's slowing down enough to actually notice their felt sense and realize that they don't have words for it, and then try to have words for it. And often that ends up sounding like, right? It's an uncertainty. Because you don't know anymore. You're accessing something that doesn't have words, and you're trying to give it words. It's more like I never know what to say. No, it's like I have to say the right things or else. It's like if I say the wrong thing, then everything falls apart and it's all ruined. And it's like I'm the only one. Like Cameron doesn't have to pay attention. It's just me. Cameron gets to again, here's a sort of pausing going on, right? Like there's something that he's noticing probably here. He gets to and how do you describe it? To relax. That's it. Yeah, it feels like I'm the only one who doesn't get to relax. Wow, I'm quite surprised at how well the way that this is like formatted, for example, allows you to get that experience of the felt sense being accessed. So, felt sense as the layer below language. Mark Littman, in his document Folding, proposes that the felt sense, or the felt meaning, as he calls it, exists as a layer of information below language. He gives the following examples. Pick a word, such as yogurt, and say it many times over. Yogurt, 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 yogurt. Now eventually it may feel like the word has lost its meaning. The verbal handle of yogurt has become disconnected from the felt sense it used to be associated with. Never thought about trying that. I'm gonna have to try that more later. What happens when you lose that handle of the word? It's a funny thing, because thinking back on times when that has happened, you start to feel like, is this even a real word? There's no way this is a real word, right? Suddenly it just seems so ridiculous. Like it's floating all at sea, and it's just become disconnected from all meaning and association. Like, how could a word like yogurt exist? It's so weird looking. So weird sounding. Or it's not just individual words that are connected to felt senses. You can also know the meaning of a sentence that you just read, or have a sense of what a particular paragraph was saying. Right? Yeah. You can get a meaning from a sentence without having to, right? That's what paraphrasing is, right? How do you paraphrase something? It's not necessarily a logical process, but you're like, okay, I just read that sentence, I just read that paragraph. I think I got the sense of it, I got the meaning of it, and now let me try to put words to that sense that I have of what I just read, right? It's not me going and looking up synonyms for everything that was said in that paragraph or that sentence. It's me coming up with new language myself to describe the general sense that I got of the meaning. Sometimes, if you are working on a document close to a deadline or trying to read something when you're tired, you may find that the thing becomes slippery. Your eyes might repeatedly pass over the same words, but you don't understand what they are saying. You are failing to extract the felt sense holding the meaning of the text. Yep, I know what that feeling's like. Being in bed, trying to read a book, and your eyes like glaze over, and you feel like you're reading the words, but they just like, it's like, just like trying to hold on to water. Like they just don't go in. They don't stay in your mind. And there is like a whole somatic weather. There's a feeling in you, right? It's not just it's not as simple as saying, I can't remember what I just read. It's like there's a whole feeling of laying there in bed and being so sleepy and trying to hold on to the words with your eyes and understand them, but not being able to, right? There's a whole somatic experience of that. He notes that a felt sense can also be experienced as a place as a thing or a place to return to. When you say something and it doesn't come out right, you try again. Where your mind goes before you try again, that's felt meaning. When someone says, "Can you explain that in different words?" your mind goes back to that, in other words, felt meaning. Which is kind of what I was saying about paraphrasing something that you just read, You're going back to what the sense of it is for you, not going back to the exact words that you just read. When someone says, "What do you mean by that?" your mind goes back to that, in other words, felt meaning. When you're writing something, and it's hard, what you're searching for is felt meaning. Where you're searching is where felt meaning will be. That's actually great, because I think that's something, when you experience writer's block and you're like, I have this thing, it's a something, it's not yet articulate, obviously, because I haven't written it, and I'm struggling to express what it is, right? And so the only way, technically, to articulate that is to attempt to articulate it. But then we also have this other part of us that's criticizing every attempt that we make. And it's like, oh no, that's not it. Or it's like, that's not it and that's shitty. Everyone's going to think you're an idiot, right? And so you not only don't yet have the words to articulate your felt sense and your felt meaning, every time you try, you shut yourself down. So you get nowhere, and then you just have a blank page and you're stuck. Writer's block. Right? As opposed to, if for example, you just didn't have that part of you shutting you down every time you tried to write something, right? If that wasn't happening, you could just try. And you could be like, oh, did that get it? Closer, right? Did that get it? Oh, yes. Or like, oh, that's even more close. Or, oh, no, that took me further away, right? And there's none of that, like, oh, this is good or bad. What are people going to think? You can just try. And that's how you begin to be able to articulate yourself more clearly. That's when writing becomes easier, because then you're really just using writing as a way to figure out what you mean. And you're not worried about what anyone else is going to think. So that doesn't mean that you're going to have amazing writing, but it means you're not going to have writer's block anymore, and that's a big thing. Becoming prolific, taking away, right? Being prolific is actually quite easy when you just take away that critical thing going on that just shuts down your ability to even try to articulate your felt meaning. And once that's gone, you can be extremely prolific and just try and try and try to articulate yourself, and you get to know what you think even better, right? Think of how much understanding you haven't been able to experience of your own ideas because every attempt you've ever tried to make to articulate yourself has been shot down by that critical part of you. How much better would you understand what you even think about if you could just try? When you lose your train of thought, you've lost your sense of the felt meaning you were speaking from. When you remember what you were saying, the what is felt meaning, and if you've had that experience, you're like, oh wait, fuck, what was I saying? And then sometimes it just comes back to you. It's like a spark in you. You're like, I got it. I grasped it. You don't even remember exactly what you were saying. You don't remember what the exact words you were saying before were, but you remember the feeling. It comes back to you, and you usually light up, right? There's usually a kind of whole body response. So, why learn to tap into felt senses? Why are felt senses important? Well, a felt sense looks like it's coming from some deeper information processing layer in your brain. If you do anything at all, such as read or talk, you are tapping into that layer. Everyone accesses felt senses all the time, but you can learn to more explicitly pay attention to the fact that you're doing it, and thus do it more effectively. This has a great number of benefits. Yeah, when I read Genlin's paper on improvisation the other day, he talks about how improvisation is always a part of the creation of form, right? When you write something that has never been written before, it's being improvised. But I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily immediately agree with that, because while that is happening, you are generating language that you've never generated before, which is improvisational, right? You're putting words to something that has not ever had words before, because we're not very sensitive to what's going on and like the intricacies of that process and what, how the felt sense is involved in that. You wouldn't be like, oh, I'm not improvising. You're just like, I'm coming up with words and they're good or they're bad, right? But you wouldn't understand it to be improvisational, and you probably are not really noticing, maybe just because you don't even have a language for it, right? You don't have a concept for it, that felt sense. If you don't have that idea, if you don't have a name for that felt piece of that experiential process, then you're not really going to be able to point to it. So you might be trying to write something and you know that you're not writing what you ultimately are trying to express, but you don't have the concept of felt sense to talk about it with. So you're just like, I don't know, I'm failing here, right? And it becomes a very blunt, your ability to describe and talk about what's going on in your experience is very, very blunt and shallow. Okay, so benefits. It's useful for communication. The bits about text and meaning might already have suggested this. You can express yourself most clearly when you have a good handle on the felt sense of your intended meaning. If you've ever found yourself saying, no, that's not quite what I mean it more like ... then you've been trying to connect with a felt sense better. And also, I mean, a lot of people, myself included, not so much nowadays, if you watch my videos, you know this, but it used to be that I tried to figure out everything I was going to say in my head before I said it. I was so uncomfortable with ever saying anything that wasn't already all worked out, you know? I never wanted, I was like scared, basically, ashamed of ever running into the situation where I might say something and then realize mid-sentence, like, oh, that's not quite it, you know? That was so uncomfortable for me. So I tried to work out everything in my head before I ever spoke. But again, like I was saying about writer's block and how much better you can come to understand your own ideas when you don't have that other part of you just shutting down every attempt. Same thing with talking. If you can just be comfortable speaking and are attempting to articulate yourself and not worrying about like if it's right or not, you actually get to discover as you speak if it's what you mean. It's much harder to do purely in your head. Furthermore, different felt senses let you communicate different things. Matt Goldenberg recently interviewed me on what I do when I'm trying to write something that communicates across perspectives. Oh, that's interesting. I'll just open that. As a result of his questioning, I ended up describing it as something like this. I've bolded each section when I've made a reference to a felt sense. When I see people talking past each other, I get this frustration. Like, let's say someone is trying to explain meditation to someone skeptical. I see the skeptic asking questions, and I can get a sense of what their model is like and which gaps in their model they are trying to fill with those questions. And then the other person doesn't seem to get that and says something else. It feels like there are two different perspectives on the same issue. They are almost physical shapes with some overlap, but which don't quite align. And I get an urge to build a bridge between them, to get those two perspectives joined together. So then I start getting some ideas about it, of what kind of explanation would fit that hole in the skeptic's model, and what would make those perspectives sync up. And there's a sense of harmony and beauty in what that finished explanation would feel like. Then I have all of those scattered ideas and I note them down and I try to find something that would feel like a unifying framework, where the ideas wouldn't feel separate from each other, but rather be part of a coherent structure. And I try to make use of that underlying framework to write it so that there's a smooth flow of one idea to the next, so that each thing flows naturally to the next. And while I'm writing it, I make sure to come back to a sense of my target audience, and I try to have a feel of what they would think of my explanation. Sometimes when I'm writing an essay, it starts feeling hard to say who I'm writing to, and then I might end up writing something on Twitter or Facebook where I have a clearer sense of who's going to read this, and then that might help me make progress. So when I read that, I was visualizing something sort of what he was talking about, right? This like physical shapes that overlap but don't align, and building a bridge. And you think about like that whole idea of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, right? Sometimes when you're working with ideas, that's literally what it can feel like when you figure out like an explanation or a concept that helps connect stuff. It's like, oh, finally I have a square peg for a square hole, or I have a round peg for a round hole, and they just fit together, right? It's not because of a logical thing of like, oh, well, this new concept like checks this box and this box and this box and fits perfectly logically with all the other things. It's like, oh shit, no, actually, it just clicks. It clicks into place, right? Why do we say that? It clicks into place when we're talking about ideas and concepts. Right? There's a feeling, and it's satisfying. There's harmony and beauty in that. Yeah. Okay. I hadn't explicitly thought about it in those terms, but Matt's poking helped me make more aware of all the felt senses that I was following, and he was explicitly digging them out of me in order to teach them to others. Having them, I can turn them into explicit guidelines to ask myself or others, such as, if you need ideas, is there any particular situation whose felt sense gives you ideas, such as getting frustrated by two people failing to communicate and seeing what they could be saying instead? If you have several ideas, do you feel like you could get a sense of how to explain them in such a way that they flow from one thing to another? Do you have a clear feeling of who you're writing to? If not, could you get one? Such as, I feel like even what just happened when I was reading is an example of a felt sense, right? I'm like, if not, could you get one? And I'm like, that doesn't fit right. That doesn't feel right with what the sense of the meaning that he's saying is, right? Like, the way in which I was intoning, the way that I said one, was an expression of how I was understanding the word one in the context of this paragraph. And it was like, that doesn't make sense with the meaning. So it's, do you have a clear feeling of who you're writing to? If not, could you get one? Could you get one as in someone? Or clear feeling, right, of who you're writing to? Could you get one? Not. Yeah. So if not, could you get one? Such as by writing something on social media, or as a forum post, or imagining a specific person reading it. Yeah, think about that too, like what I was saying about, fitting a square peg in a round hole or whatever. When it clicks, how satisfying that can be. The same thing can happen when you're trying to explain something to somebody, and you can tell that how you're conceptualizing the thing and how you're sequencing the ideas and how you're putting it together is clicking with them, and it's like that same harmony, right? It's clicking. The square peg is going into a square hole. It's not just butting up against them and not going in. Okay. It's useful for creating and appreciating art. As an example of different felt senses being useful for communicating different things, Logan Stroll writes about the use of them in art. Pick an expressive medium. Could be sketching, poetry, music, whatever. Then, get in touch with the felt sense. You don't have to name it, but try to get inside of it. What is get inside of it? Right now, there's a tightness in my solar plexus. I can describe it from the outside like so. It's the bottom of a sort of hot, slightly vibrating rod of sensation that goes from my solar plexus to the middle of my throat. The sensation responds to awareness of my immediate auditory environment. I'm in a coffee shop. The solar plexus tightness gets tighter when I pay attention to the tapping of a metal spoon against a metal jar, and starts to wobble a little when I pay attention to the music in the background. Rather than describing it from the outside, I can also let the felt sense express itself from the inside. This is a kind of attentional trick, I think, which seems to involve setting down my personhood story and letting the felt sense consume awareness. Then, while inside of the felt sense, I can begin to act on my creative medium. If I choose just a few words, the solar plexus felt sense types this: wobble, siren, sharp and hot, fight for warming Persian music, hold ready, parking alarm to protect, changing, nothing safe. So I'm just reminded too, like Anne Weiser Cornell, who is one of Jen Lin's students, part of one of the questions that she often will offer in a focusing process is like, does that felt sense have an emotional quality to it? How would it describe itself? Right? So it's kind of similar to what's being said here. It's like, let it express itself from the inside. Rather than you describing it, how would it describe itself? How would it describe its experience? Logan then goes on to describe the process of drawing a picture from inside the felt sense, letting each line resonate against the felt sense and only draw things which feel true to it. This is what artists are actually doing when they create things. They're doing additional stuff too, because what I've described is merely expression, and art is a kind of communication. Communication is a refined form of expression that usually involves design and editing in addition to expressing. But I think the unrefined expression is at the core of art. Actually, in the paper about improv that I read the other day, Jen Lin talks about this. The artist trying to find the next right line to make, and how it's kind of like that tip of the tongue experience of like, I don't know exactly what the right word is, but I can feel it, right? And if you're making art and you're not necessarily just trying to copy, right? If you're not just a copyist and you're trying to express something that doesn't yet already exist, you don't know really what it's going to be, but you have a feeling, you have a sense of what comes next. What's the next right line to put down on the page? Okay. This matches my experience when I'm doing role-playing or writing fictional characters. Each character has their own felt sense, and writing them is often about getting inside that felt sense. Characters may start with a weak felt sense, but take on a life of their own when that sense gets fleshed out and becomes strong enough. Sometimes I have difficulty expressing a particular character, in which case I have lost my connection to their felt sense, their essence, so to speak. On a few occasions, I have intentionally created characters by taking aspects of the felt senses of my friends and blended them together into a new whole that feels right. We kind of talked about this a little bit on our very first Shift 30 call. The question came up about, if you do write fiction, how do you go about creating characters and, building an emotional life and behavior for those characters? That's kind of what we got into, was what's in this paragraph. I have also heard of poetry being described essentially as trying to convey a felt sense through words. I think much of art is basically all about evoking felt senses. If you have that as an explicit concept, you can look at a piece of art that you like and attempt to describe its felt sense in greater detail. That may help you dig deeper into what about it you like and make you feel that thing you like more. I heard recently a lifelong photographer talk about this and what it was about his favorite photographers that stood out to him, and it was like, when I looked at these people's photography for the first time, it made me feel like this almost like electricity all through my body, you know? So it's not just because, oh, it's like really pretty, it's really beautiful. It's like, no, seeing this thing gave me such an intense felt sense. And that's what makes it a powerful piece of art. The felt sense is good for knowing what you want. Tapping into felt senses associated with the things that you want feels valuable in general. Rawson writes, I used to think of myself as someone who was very spontaneous and did not like to plan or organize things any more or any sooner than absolutely necessary. I thought that was just the kind of person I am, and getting overly organized would just feel wrong. That's pretty common, right? I mean, some people feel the opposite way, but it's pretty common to feel like either, oh, I just hate organization, or I love organization, and the opposite feels wrong. But I felt a lot of aberrant bouts of anxiety. I probably could have figured out the problem through standard focusing, but I was having trouble with the negative feeling, and I found it easier to focus on positive feelings. So I began to apply focusing to when I felt happy. That's something we can totally do. And sometimes, and it happens in shift 30, right, that we tend to be like, oh, we only want to talk or explore something that's like painful or icky. But it's not just about dark, heavy things. It can be happy things too, good feelings. You can explore good feelings just as much as you can explore unpleasant feelings. And a common trend that emerged from good felt senses was a feeling of being in control of my life. And it turned out that this feeling of being in control came from having planned to do something I wanted to do and having done it. I would not have noticed that experiences of having planned well made me feel so good through normal analysis, because that was just completely contrary to my self-image. Right? So it's like, if you were trying to just logically say, like, these are my values, this is my self-image, this must be what I like, without any reference to your actual felt sense of what feels good, then you might end up with something, but it has nothing to do with how you actually feel. But by focusing on what made me have good feelings, I was able to shift my self-image to be more accurate. I like having detailed plans. Who would have thought? Certainly not me. Once I realized that my self-image of enjoying disorganization was actually the opposite of what actually made me happy, I was able to begin methodically organizing and scheduling my life. Since then, those unexplained bouts of anxiety have vanished, and I feel happier more of the time. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, this bit has been especially powerful to read for me. It's like, yeah, that's the intricacy that you can get at with focusing and with felt sense is like, okay, well, I have this idea in my head, I have this concept of myself, but does it actually match how I feel? Like, how do I actually feel about that? What actually feels good? And if you just try to hold fast to the concept that you have of yourself, this identity that you have of yourself, then you will kind of be deaf or blind to the actual intricacies of your experience. Sometimes I get the feeling that a thing that I'm doing seems good on paper, but in practice it just feels like a demotivating chore. Often this means that the thing that I think I'm going for is not the thing that my brain is actually optimizing for, and it's predicting that the project in question will not fulfill its actual optimization goal. If I can then lean into the felt sense of what I actually want, then I will feel more motivated to pursue it. Yeah. So there's this interesting thing, right? It's like, that whole like follow your passions idea, right? And I've seen the Wilderless talk about this on Twitter. He's like, it's not so smart to just grab onto that idea of like follow your passions, because sometimes our internal lives are so noisy and we're so bad at listening to them, right? It was two different things. Sometimes you just don't have any ability to be sensitive and listen to what's actually going on in your internal world, right? And then sometimes, and maybe at the same time, it's so noisy, right? You're just full of like intense dramatic emotion, right? Like highly triggered emotion, traumatic, responsive emotion, that what you're really doing if you're pursuing your passion is just like going after like feelings of euphoria and mania, which is different from checking in with your felt sense. But yeah, if you can listen to your felt sense and be like, oh, what is it that I actually want? What is it that I'm actually going for? It's like, this project doesn't actually get at the thing that I actually want in this particular way. And maybe that is just something that you can't articulate at first. Maybe it's just a something, but you're like, this project isn't really getting at it. There's something else that's unaddressed. And then you can do that. You can focus on that and be like, well, what is that something else that I want which is unaddressed? And then you can be like, oh, it's this. And then realize, actually, there's this other way that I can get that. And I don't have to do that project, actually. There's a better project. So you can get way more intricate about how to get the things that you actually want by using your felt sense. Okay, so here's another example. For example, recently, I have been trying to debug my aversion towards dating sites. There seem to be several components to that aversion, but one in particular is a vibe of, I don't expect this to really work, that I tend to get at the point when I start to browse other people's profiles. Which raises the question of, doesn't work for what exactly? Not just for getting into a relationship. What's the deeper desire that makes me want a relationship in the first place? So far, I had been kind of waffling back and forth on the question of, do I want children? So my search filters had included people with various answers to that question. But then I accidentally ended up doing a search where the answer was required to be yes, and noticed that the kinds of profiles I got in response, or just consistently seeing wants children on all the results I got, gave me a much, I think there's probably a missing word there, gave me a felt sense of, this could lead somewhere promising. Interesting. The main thing doesn't seem to be just the thought of having children, but also something about the potential partners generally being the type of people who want children due to some personality trait which I haven't verbalized yet, but which was more apparent in the profiles that I started seeing, which started making the whole dating site thing seem more appealing again. Nice. So he used his felt sense. He got more clarity around like how he was feeling in relation to people who matched this particular quality, right? And it's not just the fact of having kids which makes them attractive, but something about them more than the other set of people gave him a better feeling. And then that better feeling also made the whole thing less averse, or he felt less averse to the whole thing, right? So you now like, I mean, you could talk about it in different words and be like, oh, well, I'm no longer like repelled from doing that, so it's not like I need motivation to do that thing. It's because I'm not pushed away, or I'm not holding it at arm's length anymore, because actually I've gotten through that. I have a better sense of what I want. I've had a felt shift because of this accuracy around my felt senses that I've explored. In a way, finding this particular felt sense when I was feeling demotivated feels like the same kind of thing as finding who was my target audience for this piece of writing again, when I've been feeling demotivated by writing. In either case, the brain is pursuing some optimization target, but cannot proceed and reacts by demotivation if a clear optimization target cannot be found, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if you're putting all this effort into something which is actually not going to get you the thing that you want, it's like, why the fuck spend all that energy, right? So you become averse to the whole thing. It's like, why am I wasting my time? I'm not motivated to do this because it's not actually going to get me what I want. When you have a clearer sense of what you want by going through this process that Kai is describing here, motivation gets way better. Like, it doesn't even, a lot of time it's like not even that big of a deal, because you're just like, oh, what do I actually want? And as you get clearer on what you actually want, you have the fucking motivation to do it because you want it. Michael Smith has recently been talking about leaning into pleasure and of how society tends to cause psyches to be built around avoiding pain rather than pursuing joyful, bright desire. I'm coming to agree with Rawson's post in that we probably tend to undervalue using felt senses to look into the positive and don't pursue the bright desire as much as we could, in part because we haven't spent time really digging into the felt senses of enjoyment. Though it needs to be stated that often one's mind has reasons for why it considers it necessary to feel bad, so it does often make sense to investigate those reasons first. Yeah. There are like entire beliefs that we have about things being good and things being bad that just make entire avenues of exploration off the table, right? It's like, I'm not even going to think about what feels good because feeling good is a sin or something like that, right? Or like, hard work is necessary. If you don't work hard, you're a lazy piece of shit. Well, then you're not going to investigate how actually maybe it feels good to not work so hard, and how maybe you can accomplish more sometimes without working very hard, because you believe hard work is a virtue. So there are also those reasons to investigate. It's a great point. Generally, your aesthetics encode information and assumptions about what your brain considers valuable. Aesthetics are, to a large extent, expressed in felt senses. Felt sense is useful for figuring out what's bothering you. The standard use for the felt sense, from Genlin's original book, is figuring out what bothers you. Duncan Sabian already gave us an example of this previously, when figuring out why an imaginary Cameron was bothering him. Listening to felt senses is the foundation of focusing-oriented psychotherapy, right? Which is that book. Well, it's more than just a book, but that's that book that I'm reading or reviewing on YouTube, as well as practices such as internal double crux, internal family systems, coherence therapy, and experiential forms of therapy in general. This excerpt from Unlocking the Emotional Brain described Richard getting in contact with a felt sense of what his mind thought would happen if he expressed confidence. Richard: now, I'm feeling really uncomfortable, but it's different in a way. Therapist: okay, let yourself feel it. This different discomfort. See if any words come along with this uncomfortable feeling. Richard. Now they hate me. Therapist. Now they hate me. Good. Keep going. See if this really uncomfortable feeling can also tell you why they hate you now. Richard. Wow, it's because now I'm an arrogant asshole. Like my father. A totally self-centered, totally insensitive know-it-all. Therapist. Do you mean that having a feeling of confidence as you speak turns you into an arrogant asshole like Dad? Richard. Yeah, exactly. Wow. As a result of having surfaced this felt sense, Richard was then able to question it and revise the belief contained in it. The felt sense helps you know when you're triggered. I think of being triggered meaning something like a part of you tries to force a particular outcome even if your other parts would disagree with this being a good idea. This feels closely related to the Buddhist notion of craving for specific outcomes. I mean, this also makes me think very much of this whole non-coercion movement. Can we call it a movement? This non-coercion community of people, right? About people who are very averse to being in this state. I'm a part of this, right? Averse to having a part of you forcing an outcome that the rest of you is not on board with. If I think about situations where I wish I had acted differently, they include things like I told my cousin that I was interested in moving something closer to psychology, career-wise. My cousin said something that I thought implied she didn't think I knew much about psychology, reflecting a very old model of me. I felt a strong desire to correct that misconception, and there was something of a sharp forcefulness in that response, trying to force her into thinking the right thing. Yeah. It's like, no, you're wrong. I mean, there's so much to explore even just in that little situation, right? It's like there's something in you that's like, no, that's not me. And also, you have to know, I need you to know and hear what is correct, what I actually am like. Or I overheard some parents treating their child in a way that felt to me hurtful towards the child. And there was a desire to intervene and force them to act differently towards their child. But of course, I knew that it wouldn't do any good. I got a message that I would have preferred not to receive or read, but for as long as it remained unread, there was an insistent tugging, as if something was trying to force it to become read, and another something trying to force it to not be read. Right? And then you become stuck. One part of you wants to do it, one part of you doesn't want to do it, right? I mean, I'm using parts. You could think of that in terms of IFS. Genlin uses parts language sometimes, but he doesn't really name the parts. But yeah, there's something in you that wants to do it, and there's something in you that doesn't want to do it, and there's an impasse, and you just don't do either. Well, I mean, maybe one is stronger, right? And so maybe you override it and you do it, but the part of you that didn't want to do it is now like, fuck, you just like made me feel all vulnerable or whatever it is. So there's going to be consequence either way if there's this battle between the two desires. Maybe one succeeds and conquers the other, but there's going to be consequence to that because the other side is protecting against some other consequence. Besides the specific and somewhat different felt senses in all three of those situations, there's also a shared general felt sense of some sort of wrongness, as if my mind feels that there is something wrong about the world which needs to be fixed. As long as that part is trying to force that fix, I can't think or react entirely freely. When I'm triggered, it's not always clear to me. I might be so strongly triggered that the thought just seems like absolute truth to me, or the triggering might be subtle enough that it might pass almost unnoticed. But if I pay attention to the sense of wrongness that I typically get when triggered, I can have something of a trigger action plan and notice when I'm triggered and pause to see what the appropriate response could be. The opposite of the wrongness of being triggered feels something like the internal family system's notion of the 8 C's of being in self: confidence, calmness, creativity, clarity, curiosity, courage, compassion, and connectedness. Noticing that I do not have those kinds of felt senses also helps to notice when I'm triggered, right? This is also a kind of, he doesn't exactly have this in one of his examples, but like the impulse to give advice, right? Unasked for advice. It's like you're experiencing that someone else is wrong, and that state of wrongness is triggering you, and you're like, I need to correct them. Let me give them advice. Let me tell them what is right. Is it actually necessary to do that? Who can say? But you have this strong felt sense of needing to fix this wrongness that you've experienced, right? It's interesting to think about that too when you see all these like letters to my younger self, or like videos on YouTube about like the advice I wish I had when I was 20 years old. It's like, if you feel that need, if you like revisit your younger self and you feel that felt sense of needing to fix and correct that younger person, that's interesting. That's something to explore, right? How is it that you feel and think about yourself then, and how you feel about your life situation now, that your response to revisiting your younger self is that, oh, you need to go back and correct them? Is it really necessary? It might feel like it. Anyway, conclusion. There are a number of explanations of how to do focusing. That is, tap into your felt senses. Some here on Less Wrong include ones by, particularly recommended, Duncan Sabian, that guy, and Mark Shu. The Focusing Institute offers this page of 6 steps, which are further elaborated in Eugene Genlin's book. My personal favorite set of formal focusing instructions is in Anne Weiser Cornell's The Power of Focusing. For some reason, everyone always seems to recommend the original focusing book, even though AWC's instructions feel 10 times better to me. That's what we're actually using in Shift 30 when we do focusing. I've been using Anne Weiser's, because it's also not necessarily steps, which is something I like, that Anne Weiser gives you a set of questions, and they're loosely in a sequence, but they're not necessarily numbered, so you're not feeling constricted to go through in order. And that's a thing that Genlin says. It's like, well, both of them say, Anne Weiser Cornell and Genlin, that it's about the relationship, it's about the people, it's about the experience of the client, the focuser, not about the technique. And if you end up making it more about the technique and running the technique and doing it correctly, and you forget about the person, then you're fucking it up, basically. Right, so That's what's nice about how she lays it out in The Power of Focusing, is that it's not like this strict process that makes you feel like there's one perfect way to do it. Anyway, that said, I always feel like formal focusing instructions risk making the felt sense feel like this super exotic, super special thing. And then you might end up wondering things like, is this really the felt sense? Way too much. Remember, the felt sense is nothing special. If you understand what this sentence is saying, you already have access to a felt sense, the one which tells you what the meaning of this sentence is. And Jenlin says that too often. He's like, I didn't come up, like, everyone has the felt sense. Everyone already does focusing. I just put a name on this thing that people already do. Maybe some people have forgotten how to do it, but like, it's not this new skill that I'm teaching. It's something that people just do. It's a capacity that we have. He says that. He's like, focusing is not mine. Thus, my favorite approach to tapping into a felt sense is just imagine I was explaining this feeling that I have to someone else, taking the time to find the words and description that resonate the most. In other words, in explaining felt senses, I would recommend you to go not for the felt sense of explaining some exotic and special thing deep in my subconscious, but rather for the felt sense of explaining a thing in my everyday experience and just wanting to find out exactly the right words for it. Yeah, great way to end, You don't need fancy words. That's really antithetical to it. Fanciness has no part in focusing, right? You're not trying to sound good. You're not trying to be correct for other people. It's about finding the words that are accurate to describe your felt sense. And those might be really simple words, right? It might just be sad, or I feel dumb, I feel gross, I feel like throwing up, I feel angry, fuck, ugh, right? It doesn't have to be fancy psychological language. So, yeah, that was Kai's article, finally. The felt sense. What, why, and how. So thanks, Kai, for writing this. This was really good. I'm glad I finally read it. If you have watched this video, listened to this video, I appreciate you, and I would love to hear your comments, your thoughts on this entire topic, any questions that you have from anything that I've said, or about focusing in general, about the felt sense in general. I make these things personally as a way to study and learn this stuff better, but also to basically create my side of the conversation, So if these spark conversations, I feel like I'm succeeding. So please, if you feel like reaching out, reach out. And until then, have a great, great day.